Hi there, my name is Troels and welcome to Soundpaint. I got a question for you. When was the last time you saw a new music instrument? Especially in the ears and eyes of mainstream. For me, the last real instrument that really encapsulated the entire world was the computer. And it's old by modern standards. It's been around for quite a while. And this is where the tale of today's library begins. This is so near and dear to me. This is going to be a lengthy video as well because there's so much to show and tell. It's not just about my approach to it. We have three wonderful performers that is also going to show you how they work with this vintage technology that I'm about to show you. But on top of that, we also have a long interview with Andy. That was the guy that recorded this library. It's 29,000 samples deep. We are in the realm of ultra deep sampling and we're in the realm of 1-bit computing. Now, you've probably never heard about 1-bit. I actually hadn't before we got started with this because I sort of thought that the early days of computer music started with 8-bit, but lo and behold, that is not true. 8-bit was later on, but there's actually two generations before that. There was a 4-bit generation and then there was a 1-bit generation. And everything we're going to be listening to today, everything we're going to be playing, everything I'm about to show you is made with a 1-bit synthesizer. In this case, it's the first computer I ever got my hands on. It's the computer I grew up with. It's the ZX Spectrum 48 kilobytes by the fantastic mind Lord Sinclair, who was the inventor of this magnificent unit. Try to take a look here how beautiful it is. It has these weird like rubber-like keys. It has little rainbows down on the side. I actually thought it was incredibly beautiful for its time, and even looking at it today, it's a little bit like looking at an old Olivetti typewriter, which really inspired Apple's design in more modern age. I think the Spectrum had something down. It was so fresh for its age. So there are many unique stories to the ZX Spectrum, and we're going to go very, very deep into them in this video here. So if you're into chiptunes and chiptune history, this is an amazing source of material. It's about as deep as it will possibly ever get. These machines are slowly dying, but Andy, who recorded it, has a whole array of them and ultra deep sampled many different ones of them. In fact, this library wasn't just made with 1 or 2 ZX Spectrums. He has 7 different ZX Spectrums to record from. He also have all the additional attachments to them. So we have rhythm machines or drum machines. We have speech synthesis, which is 1-bit speech synthesis in the library as well. So anything possibly imaginable in the 1-bit realm of the ZX Spectrum is inside of this library. And it's such a joy to be able to show you because this is the foundation of my musical background. It really began with this computer. And in the year after, that was 1983, I heard Herbie Hancock's Rocket, which really put me on a different trajectory as well. I thought that was the coolest thing I've ever heard, and that was really what got me into music. But the ZX Spectrum was the first time I had a computer, and as you're about to see and hear, these were days where you really had to be resourceful. There was a competitive computer called the Commodore 64 that we also have in Soundpaint as an ultra deep sample library. The C64 had a SID chip that had 3 voices in it. But with the ZX Spectrum, it was a lot more primitive. It was 1-bit and you only had 1 voice to play around with. So you had to be incredibly resourceful. In fact, when you made a video game, you had to make the choice between whether you wanted graphics in it or whether you wanted sound, because the computer wasn't strong enough to do both. So how does one resolve that? Well, this brilliant programmer that made a very famous video game, probably the most famous video game ever made for the ZX Spectrum called Manic Miner, figured out that he could do 1 frame of graphics, 1 frame of sound, 1 frame of graphics, and keep running in that cycle, which is absolutely brilliant. And it gave us sort of a choppy kind of chiptunes, bleep blop kind of sound. And that became a huge part of the chiptune aesthetic, but it was really a forceful premise that, hey, I want sound in my game, but I can't have graphics and sound at the same time, so I'll replace each frame independently with graphics and sound. That's the realm we're in. That's the madness of 1-bit world. But without further ado, let's get into it here. I want to show you a bunch of different things. As I mentioned, this is going to be a long video. I'll take you through a variety of the programs here. There's over 29,000 samples, as I mentioned, so there's a lot to show. Later on, we're going to see Peter Dyer and Sherri Chung and Nicholas Semrad also show their approach and very musical approach to this kind of style of library and music. And in the end, we have a big, beautiful interview with Andy that recorded this, and he's one of the leading authorities in the world with chiptunes and spent years on recording this. This project has actually been going for quite a while. We have other ultra deep sample libraries also coming from Andy's brilliant mind and really, really comprehensive sampling. So it's not an emulation, it's not a simulation, even though that's appropriate for video games. This is truly like sitting with the unit. But keep in mind that it only had one voice. So the second we start playing in polyphony, it was like having multiple computers side by side, and imagine that inside of Soundpaint with morphing and DSP effects and everything imaginable in terms of analog modulation. It would simply not be possible back at the time. And I think if anyone had even tried to explain what I'm about to show you in 1982, it would be completely like, that's not possible. So let me show you what's possible. Let's get inside of Soundpaint. I mean, isn't that just magical? So much power in this sound here. So every time you play the same key, you get a natural variation in the sound. Here is another arpeggiator called Wonders. I mean, Lord knows how many computers it would take to generate that back in the day. It's like a crazy thought. Let's try Wowzers here, which is another arpeggiator. And if you notice here in the UI, you'll notice that there's actually two different spectrums overlaid here. So when I move the mod wheel up, it gets a lot more intensive with a second layer. Let me turn the delay off here. Just listen to the sound on its own. You hear that grid on the top? That's the 1-bit resolution. And even though in Soundpaint we have very advanced tools for emulating bit sort of resolution, there's nothing quite like a hardware analog generated 1-bit sound. It's just nasty in a way that is indescribable. Check this one out here. They're so beautiful when you layer them, you just get so much magic out of the sound. And really that punchy kind of 1-bit sound. Here is a beautiful patch. And he also recorded arpeggiations inside of the machine. Because it's one voice, there's not a lot you can do when it comes to chords, except that you can play things so fast in arpeggiations that it sounds like a chord even though it isn't. Check these out, these ornaments here, they're so sweet. They're kind of like string runs almost. Aren't they sweet? You can actually put them in an arpeggiator and make these sort of very elaborate string runs, if you will. Here is another arpeggiation, a little bit inspired by a game called Crazy Comets from the Commodore 64, and we'll get back to that as well, because there was sort of a, either you were in the ZX Spectrum camp or you were in the C64 camp, and you really did not like each other well. Later on that sort of became irrelevant because the C64 totally took over. But back when the Spectrum was hot, like you were either in either camp of them. Anyway, so check out this next patch here. It has a very, very sort of 1-bit like sound. But the root note is the same no matter what. So like da 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 da. It sort of has that sort of nightly quality. Something like that. All right, here's something called Art Flutter. And let's put that inside of an arpeggiator. It really sounds and feels like an old analog synthesizer, just with that sort of 1-bit thing on the top. Let me take the effects off here so you can really hear it in its raw state. You hear that high-pitched sound? Really that 1-bit sort of compression. But it's fat too. It's not like it has a totally like thin sound. Up here a little bit. Just hear that. That sort of high-pitched sound is always the 1-bit sort of trademark. Another one of those sort of knighthood sounds. It reminds me a lot about Defender of the Crown. That was the first video game I got to ever score, and it was one of my favorite video games all the way back to the C64 as well. I don't remember if it was made for the Spectrum, but I just love this sort of classic chiptune sound. Here's a sound, also an arpeggiator that's very sort of modern sounding. You can arp that. Isn't that beautiful? Like a 1-bit synthesizer sounding so fat and smooth. Forgive me if I sometimes let these things play for too long. I'm just so inspired because it's so analog and natural. You can just let it roll like this. And there's always something going on. The sort of richness of analog technology where everything is alive. No keys are ever the same. Even when you repeat the same note in this library, because it's ultra deep sampled, you're gonna get a natural variation and it's so beautiful. Okay, let's try warm past here. I gotta get out of my arpegiation showings here. There's a lot more to show. Okay, so this one here, very, very classic. It has that sort of detuned sound. All right, here's one last arp. This one almost sounds a little more like a modern kind of noise generator. And of course, inside of the arpeggiator, you can do whatever you want. This is just one rhythm. We can totally modify it. I bet you we can make this into an effect. Let me try to speed this one up here. It should become an effect almost at some point when it's too fast. All right, next up is some basses. Let's just start with the most classic sound. This is a unison sound, and it has a little bit of a phasey quality to it and a little bit of that sort of detuned, unstable thing that you get. Keep in mind that these are old chipsets, so they're analog hardware and they do degrade over time and get personality as well. So in this case here, this is one of the spectrums with a sort of detuned but still fat quality to it. I mean, it's amazing. If you just listen to this one note, let's just let it like run out. So much stuff going on. Almost like a reactor-like feel to it. Let's try another one here. So fat. And hear this? Not the same sound, so you get natural variations on the same keys as well. This is known as round robin in acoustic sampling. It's a little bit different in Soundpaint, but you really get that natural analog variation of the same sound. Here's another bass, face. Bass square. And you can just hear that's just old as. So unstable, but still beautiful in its own right. All right, I forgot actually. I made a couple of additional arpeggiations here. Let me just quickly play them for you because I love these guys. This one for me has very much that 1-bit quality. Always a little bit sort of alive and bubbly and playful. Here's another one. This one is using the BPD delay. So you can hear there's a lot of stuff when we turn it on. So that was a little bit about arpeggiations. It was a little bit about basses, but let me also show you what you can do with drums. As I mentioned at the beginning, we sampled external drum modules that was 1-bit based, and we did them rather extensively. We actually have all of them. So let me just play you some of them here. And don't think about pristinely high resolution, 24-bit, 48 kilohertz, whatever kind of kids. This is a different realm, but there's something cool and gritty about this 1-bit stuff. If you notice over here in the browser, you'll see that it says hi-hat, kick menu 1 and kick menu 2. That's isolation of hi-hats and kick drums as well. But let me just take you through the kits here so you can hear the sort of different sounds that they have. Beginning here with the Afro. Almost has like a 909 quality to it. You know, you get the feeling. That's sort of what the kits sound like. Here's a dance kit as well. Really like electro boogie kind of style. But there's something about these ones, this bass drum here, because it's 1-bit based, you get that kind of like, there's a punch to it, a grit to it that you don't really find in more modern sounds. And music today, which is so 80s based, can really benefit from having these original sword sounds. As you may know, for example, in Soundpaint, we have an 808 and a 909 as well that are ultra deep sample as well. I think the 808 alone has 15,000 samples just for a drum machine. It really makes a difference in terms of high-end productions when you use these quality sounds that are so vastly deep sampled. You get the natural variation of the analog stuff. So it's 100%, it's not kind of like being there, but 100% like really being there with the unit and really getting that. Let's try the electro kit here as well. This one almost has like a Herb Hancock rocket quality to it. And this one is funny, it's called house, and I guess house music really didn't exist back then, but you know, what would it sound like if someone had discovered in '82? Here is a one that has more of a sort of pong-like sound to it. I love the sound. And just one more thing regarding the drum kits. In this next example, it's our main kit, meaning that it has all the different drum kits just on one patch here. And just to give you an idea about like how diverse these are, let me just go through the keys here. But you can hear they're very, very short in their sound. I love these kind of ping pong sounds. They are so native to the 1-bit realm. Nothing is quite like them. And also how cute. All right, so that was a little bit about the drums. Next up are our effects. We also deep sampled different effects from different machines, both effects from the games themselves and also generated effects. So you have a vast catalog of 1-bit sound effects, starting here with the sirens and alarms. Let me try to turn the effects off here and let's listen to this one very, very deeply. Oh my God, this one reminds me a little bit about The Matrix. because you can almost hear the different steps that the computer is going through. Something cool about that, right? Let me try to put let's try to put some grain on it here, and then put a gate on the end here. Very, very analog. You hear how it's constantly just in movement? Sweet, yeah. I think there's some modern sound design to be derived from this as well. Check this next one out here. It's more like the super classical kind of chiptune sound. What's that like deep? I sometimes like to listen to these sounds really deeply because I can really hear what the computer is doing. Check this down here. You can almost hear the cycles it's going through to generate, chords and melodies as well. Remembering that it only has one voice. You can hear the sound itself is flickering within itself. So the way you do two notes is that you play them so fast in arpeggiations that it starts getting that, but it's also playing melody on top of that. So it's actually fairly sophisticated what's going on. So sweet. We also have effects divided into different lengths. These would be some of the long effects we have in the library. Oh, that's nice. Let me try to take the offset here and find this. Let me try a single note stretch on that one. Might be funny, actually. That's like the new Arps or D2 or something. So this sound is special. You might be wondering, what is that screechy kind of sound? What we're listening to is the loading sound of how you loaded games into the Spectrum. As you may know, with these old machines, this was before we had internet or anything, or even discs. We used tape cassettes, and they would have data on them, and it would take 2-3 minutes to load a video game, and you would essentially just sit and wait and listen to the sound here. It's the sound of all the data in the video game. And it's not a pretty sound at all, but for us dinosaurs that have actually gone through that period, there's some retro nostalgia on that sound. I mean, this one here, like Pac-Man dying. Oh, that's such a classic Spectrum sound. And you can hear the grindiness in the sound. Again, you have to cycle through different notes to make that sort of illusion of a lot of different things happening. Especially in the bottom. So cool. Here are the medium effects. So again, just like the other ones here, across the entire key set here with variations on them, but not as long. But in Soundpaint, it can also be funny to baptize the sounds in deep buckets of paint and see what comes out of them. In this example here, I wanted to make a patch that was more sort of guitar sounding, and this is why I call it 1-bit Hendrix. It's an attempt to do a guitar in the 1-bit realm, and of course it's not, but it's a funny little solo synthesizer. Here's a lead called Arabic Nights. Do you hear hear that there's sort of a background hum behind the sound, like a sort of buzzing reactor-like sound? Let me try to take an EQ and highlight that a little bit. It's so unique. It's just with these old sounds here, there was so much stuff going on frequency-wise. What a beautiful sound. Let me try to do a one-note stretch on this one here. And speaking of reactors, here are the bass reactors. Let's go into the realm of lead synthesizers, starting here with the Brainstar. I mean, listen to that analog goodness down here. You can hear the buzzing electricity. Here's just a cute little sort of classic one-bit sound. And here is another detune sound. This one is a little bit bigger in its sort of texture. Here's the dog barker. And an electric trumpet. Here's a farty bass. Does that sound farty? Maybe it's down here. Oh, okay. Like, who knows what a farty bass is? To me, it's just something that has that sort of... I shouldn't put that into words. You kind of feel it? Farty bass. Let me quickly end without further attention to my previous statements. Go on to the Diana Sisters here. Another great video game as well. And I love this soundtrack by Chris. I think it started like that, something like that. Also sort of good for that Euro kind of style. Here's the LFO flutter. Here's a lead octave distortion, one of the more beefy patches in the library. That's a powerful sound coming from a tiny little 48 kilobyte machine. How cool is that? Overhead flight. Here's a phase vibration, meaning that the sound is phasing and you get vibrato on the mod wheel. And this one gets us a little bit into the Commodore 64 realm. If you're a C60 lover or know the SID chip, you're probably going to recognize the sound here. As we get a little bit deeper into this demo here, I also want to show you what happens when you take those two worlds and collide them, the ZX Spectrum and the C64. But this is sort of a little heading in that direction. Here's a pulse solo. You can really hear that. That's one bit for you. It almost generates overtone and harmonics. There's like even rhythms within the sounds from all the pulsing. It's so cool. Here is something called pure. As pure as it's gonna be when you have a 1-bit sound. Pure and powerful maybe. Real dusty. Oh, it is dusty. Wow, listen to that. Fascinating. Here's Skinny Grit. It has a little more sort of a thin kind of sound, but still grit to it, if you will. So cool. I mean, when you listen to these sounds again, there's so much life in them. Just this single note here. So cool. And here is another lead synthesizer, also in the sort of C64 realm. And check how beautiful and clear it is up in the highs here. Whoa, I love that sort of sound, like. So cool. Take the fifth. Here is a morphed synthesizer using an oscillator from the unit and some of the speech synthesis that we're also going to get into soon. So morphing a 1-bit synthesizer with 1-bit speech synthesis. So sweet. Here's a lead synthesizer, again a little more thin, but with a unique sort of beautiful shine to it. Here's ugly as... So cute. In this next one here, I'm going to give you an idea about what happens when you take a Commodore 64 and a ZX Spectrum and align them. As I mentioned in the beginning, if you were back from those days, there was really like, you know, neighborhood feuds between the two different ones. Like either you were in Camp Spectrum or you're in Camp C64. So what better than in a modern age to all come to resolution and put the two together. They're so cute. So beautiful. Let me just play the C64 on its own. And then add the Spectrum on top of it. We'll come back to more C64 and Spectrum comparisons as well. Here's another lead, sort of playing more on a reactor-like vibe. Here's another example of the ZX Spectrum and the C64 as well. Let me just play the Spectrum sound alone first. And then we play the very famous lead sound from the C64. And you'll notice when I move my mod wheel down here, I'm gonna add the C64 to the Spectrum here as well. I mean, I think back then, if you proposed that was the fusion between both machines, I think people would have made amazing music. And I'll still say to this day, when I listen to Martin Galway, when I listen to Rob Hubbard and their beautiful scores, particularly from the C64, the thematic material is still some of the best ever made. I still think those are almost highlights of video games, even though they're so old, 30, 40 years old. But there's just such a potential in these sounds here, and I can't wait to hear you guys what you'll do with this sort of magical ultra deep sampling in front of you. Moving on here. Okay, next up is all our pads. You can really make elaborate big pads here. Of course, it helps when you have all the DSP effects and analog goodness inside of the engine here, but just check out how beautiful this is. I don't think anyone would think this came from 1982. I mean, isn't that just magical? So much power in this sound here. Dare I say, sonic perfection. Who would have known that we could go back to 1982 to dig out that kind of sample gold? For me, this is irreplaceable. Try that on a modern analog. It's not going to be the same. That grit in the sound. You can here on the top of the sound, that is the 1-bit resolution that is irreplaceably cool in its own right. All right, here's another pad called lick. That's a very dark lick. But really, I mean, you can make beautiful deep underscores here as well. Like this is so looming and beautiful. And you can hear a little reminiscence of the 1-bit stuff on the top of the sound. Magical, pure magic. Let's try another one here, selection. And then I just noticed something I completely forgot about. It's not only that we have drums in the library, we also have deep sampled percussive effects from the ZX Spectrum. Check this out here. And there's so many, and you can make these beautiful rhythms with them. And it's so easy. For example, I think it was like Arkanoids. Let me see if I can remember the rhythm. And all you have to do is to click step here in the step sequencer. And then you got the rhythm. And you know, if you ever want to play true homage to the way of using chiptunes and scoring with them, pretty much just use the arpeggiator. Check this one here by Jacob, it's a beautiful patch, just sort of giving a little bit of a natural kind of old school 1-bit vibe. In this last part of the video, before we really get into the performances of it, let me just show you a little bit about what you can do with the speech synthesis inside of the unit. As Andy will show you later in the video as well, he went really deep in and captured all the different ways you could do speech synthesis in these old 1-bit units. So, you know, in the modern age where we talk about Siri or all the beautiful new type of speech synthesis that have emotions in them and all these things, this is really how it started. Very, very basic, very, very rudimentary. Let me just try to do numbers for you. So just saying 1, 2, 3, 4, so you can hear how old school it is. And this was completely utilizing every single processing power inside of the unit to make these things.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
And you can really hear the bit resolution.
11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20.
And I just love them. There's such a charm in these old ways. Again, you can't generate this with modern stuff. There's just too much going on. The old circuitry of these things here. They're so cute. Or like the alphabet, for example. I think it's just so cute. Like, and they connect to do quotes as well. There's like these famous quotes in the Spectrum.
Shall we play a game?
Shall we play a game, I think?
Shall we play a game?
No thanks.
Would you prefer a nice game of chess?
Do you want to play the next game of chess? Was that what it's saying?
Would you Prefer a nice game of chess.
Prefer, okay.
Welcome, Professor Falcon.
Oh, that's so cute. Welcome, Professor.
Welcome, Professor Falcon below the thermal nuclear.
Also took a couple of them here and made sort of more phonetic, playable solo voices out of them. There's just so much richness in this library, and I could go on, and this is probably going far, far too long. I just wanted to show you all the different dimensions to this library, all the different sounds, and just talk a little bit about my journey in all of this. We are truly back in time, and these sounds are so unique, and I think they really are just waiting to be retro-purposed into modern reality. We're seeing it right now with a lot of the classic analog synthesizers used in top 40 all over. If I listen to most top 40 now, it's using these old ones. But I still think there is an open realm here of sounds that have not really been explored because most people did not pay attention to what was going on in the 1-bit realm. I surely didn't do either until Andy really educated me in it. And speaking of Andy, a little later, we have this whole wonderful interview with him. And it's just such a joy to see someone who's really been in this field for such a long time and understands the nature of 1-bit. And he talks about extensively how he's deep sampled all these things. We'll come to that. But before we get into that, we have Peter Dyer, Sherri, Chung, and Nicholas Semrad playing with the ZX Spectrum here in a much more musical sense, going through random presets and just having fun with them. And I can't wait to share. Check this out here. Nope. Yeah, exactly. Isn't that wonderful? I just love seeing other people play these patches. It gives such a different sort of dimension to how we can utilize these libraries. But most importantly, perhaps, here's Andy really going deep into how he recorded the library, his thinking behind all these machines, all the cool backstories to how they had to think back then, how resourceful they have to be when you're only working with 48 kilobytes. And Andy is such a precious jewel in terms of really educating me and hopefully you as well in terms of how these machines work. And I can't wait to show you some of the other productions we're doing as well with extensive desampling of other chiptune instruments. I really think it's a gold mine waiting to be explored out there, and especially in this 1-bit realm. Who would have known how much goodness is in here? Anyway, here's Andy, and thank you so much for watching. If you made it to this part of the video, I really encourage you to watch this next part. It is just such a brilliant story, and Andy is just such a gifted mind in terms of really appreciating these old machines.
The ZX Spectrum. So I was introduced to the Spectrum when I was a child. I, like many other kids growing up in the UK, ended up receiving one, I think, for Christmas. I'd previously had the ZX81, also made by Sinclair, another home computer. And blimey, I was excited when I got one of these, because unlike the ZX81, this had colour and this had sound. The ZX81 was resolutely silent, but this had the ability to make bleeps and bloops, which made everything more exciting, as you can imagine. I've never really lost my love for this computer. I think it's an astonishing piece of engineering. I think it's an absolutely beautiful design, but it comes with some really interesting quirks. Certainly, it was a very popular computer in the UK, and there would be many playground arguments between who had the best computer, the people who owned the ZX Spectrum and those who owned the Commodore 64, which I suppose was the big rival by Commodore, the American brand. And I don't think anyone who had a ZX Spectrum was jealous of the Commodore 64 necessarily for its games, its colour. I mean, it definitely had some technical advantages in places, the Commodore 64, but its big advantage was it had a proper sound chip. It had the SID chip, which was an amazing thing in and of itself. And the Spectrum, being the economical little bad boy that it was, didn't have any sound chip. Its sole concession to sound is the sort of thing that engineering from much earlier actually, from the 1950s and 60s had, which I've got one here that I'm taking apart, was this solitary buzzer speaker that sat soldered onto the circuit board there, connected to one of the pins on the CPU. So you could directly control it from the CPU, but it was just high or low voltage. So you could have that in two positions. You can have the speaker forwards or the speaker back, and nothing else. No clever waveforms, no anything. You'd have a square wave if you're lucky, and that was what you were. That was what you had. You plugged the TV into the computer. You didn't even get sound through the TV. You got sound through these holes drilled into the bottom of the case where that speaker was mounted, and it sounded dreadful, really. In real terms, it beeped. It was designed to do stuff like this, that went beep, and there it is. Notably, this computer, one thing, when it was doing its beeping, all of the processing stopped as I ran that there. In order to achieve a recognisable tone, I mean, I can change what note that might do. Oh, hang on, I just made that longer, excuse me. It takes all of the processing power there to drive the speaker, and the reason for that is an interesting technical limitation of this computer, because it didn't have its own sound chip, and the central processors doing everything, the CPU is doing everything. in order to make it beep, you were going, right, I want to push the speaker forward at this point in time, then some period later, you'll be going, I want to change where that speaker is, move it into its other position, and then move it forwards again, move it back again, obviously over time giving you a square wave. But there was no inbuilt clock, so you couldn't poll the clock and go, right, how long has it been since I moved that speaker? You had to work out how long the instruction set that you were running had taken, and then calculate using those instructions how many more instructions you would need before you would need to move it back again to get the desired pitch. It was really difficult. So in the ROM, there was a routine for beeping, but it stopped everything else working. So it just that was all it did. The computer itself came in two models initially, 16K and 48K. Each of them had a 16K ROM and 16K free to play with, but that includes the screen memory, so it was a tiny amount of memory, or 48K to play with, taking out the screen memory. So this was a rudimentary device for making sound. It really was, and it wasn't. Any musicians were not drawn to this particularly as a computer of choice, understandably. Then, as the computer, so it's released in 1982, but as we moved into 1983, 84, and so forth, programmers started doing really interesting things, and they're doing some clever stuff. And the big notable step that came to a lot of people's attention was Manic Miner, programmed by Matthew Smith. And I don't know anybody, if you're into the Spectrum scene, who wouldn't know that game. It's incredibly famous and sold incredibly well. Throughout the game, it plays Hall of the Mountain King. It beeps its way through that tune. And Matthew Smith had written a routine that would jump, it would effectively stop what's going on and do a little bit of beeping and play that tune, then go back to the game. And this is very unusual. Music throughout the game, it suddenly felt like an arcade game. It was very exciting. The other notable thing about that piece of software was he's also written, during the opening title screen, it played a screechy rendition of a tune that appeared to be doing what appeared to be two-channel music. Like, he's got this polyphony, two notes at once, and it was like magic how he'd achieved this. And in real terms, anybody sort of like coming to that for the first time, that is exactly what that felt like. You're going, I do not know how that can be done. You know, even if you knew about programming, there's some serious wizardry going on in the background. It's not very nice sounding, but it's screechy and impressive, though. The theory behind it, if I get technical, is quite well. It's you know, if you're into sort of what's now thought of as the one-bit music scene, a subgenre of the chiptune scene, really, the one-bit music scene, which is got this high level of restriction. What he was doing was, well, there's a number of ways you can get polyphony, but look at like a pin pulse type situation where you go, I'm going to now push the speaker in one direction, then pull it back again, and then some period later I'm going to do the same again, but that period later gives you the pitch that you're looking for. But in that time in between, you could then go, right, I'm going to push the speaker forward, then push it back again, but then some other time later I'm going to do that again. So you've got effectively two sets of pins in your waveform that you end up with. Doing this kind of thing sort of enabled some faux multi-channel stuff, which was suddenly, this was really impressive. And whereas the music scene on the Commodore 64, straight out of the gate, they had an excellent sound chip, and people started doing really good things with that. Notably in the Commodore 64 scene, you'd got people like Martin Galway, Ben Daglish, David Whittaker, who were doing really impressive things with the SID chip in the Commodore 64. They were musicians who were composing for a new instrument, it felt like. On the ZX Spectrum, you didn't have that. The musicians, being a musician was not enough. You needed to also have incredibly good programming skills to make it do anything musically valid, really. So you got people like Jonathan Smith, who was working, and he did things like Konami's Ping Pong on the ZX Spectrum, where suddenly the sound of that, although it's only single channel, had a really interesting phasey type sound to it. It's like, oh, that's impressive. He was a really astonishingly technical programmer, and used to squeeze stuff out of the 48K Spectrum that nobody had seen before and heard before, it turned out. And then you notably got people like Tim Follin, would be another name that people from the one-bit scene were now sort of look at and go, even now actually, you look at his stuff that he was doing back then, when he was a very young man, his programming skills were astonishing, coupled with really good musical chops. He created music for software like Kronos, Agent X, Agent X2, he did both of those, I think. He did the music for Sentinel, and the music on those games, particularly those first ones, were notably impressive. I remember at the time loading those games, which were pretty second-rate games actually in the main, but my word, the opening music was mind-blowing. You just, how on earth is he doing this? So my passion for the Spectrum particularly, and the what they were doing with that was has really stemmed from them. I've had that from a really young age. So it's really nice to be doing this project with this now. I've got some different models that I've kind of used for various different reasons. Actually, you can see I had that lone model, but this is a original 48K ZX Spectrum. I've got a few of those, which was then reskinned as a effectively just put in a nicer housing with the Spectrum Plus. But back then, you were loading things. All the software was, supplied on tape, so you'd be loading that from a audio cassette using a data recorder. That was just a normal tape player that you'd be connecting up to load software. You'd be waiting a few minutes to make the game load or make your software load, saving to that. Perhaps not the most robust system, but it was the delivery system at the time. It's funny, it feels funny that the computer itself had no real audio out, yet you'd got a tape recorder next to it. Or I suppose the good thing was you could sit there playing your tapes and having nice music on that rather than the beepy music on there. There were peripherals released, hardware peripherals that kind of tried to address the lack of sound. Notably, there was the Fuller box, which was released in, I think, '83, and the Melodic box, which leveraged the General Instruments AY3 819 series of sound chips, which they'd been around for some while. They're like 78, I think they are. A 3-channel proper programmable sound chip where you'd got envelopes for your sounds, you could do things with your sounds. Not a modern piece of hardware at that time, but was really a step forward. But not everybody, in fact I didn't, not everybody had those kind of sound chips, so not much software made use of it until the introduction of in 1985, get that right I think, the 128K Spectrum, which was released, and within that the new hardware revision, as well as giving 128K of usable random access memory rather than the 48K from before, it also came with the AY 38192 chip in it, which was the same chip that had been around for some years in different forms and allowed 3 channels of audio. That itself then appeared in, for instance, the Plus 2, which was released and then re-released effectively by when Amstrad bought the company, with its built-in tape recorder, but also the expanded memory and the sound chip. That sound chip, perhaps not as distinctive as the sound of the original ZX Spectrum. To be honest, it was a off-the-shelf chip, so it was something that we'd kind of heard before in a number of different, slightly different iterations to do with the clock speed of the chip, but it wasn't as unusual sounding as the sounds people were making for the 48K ZX Spectrum, sort of, because a number of things could make very similar sounds, whereas people who were making sounds for the 1-bit system of the 48K Spectrum were writing the software to completely generate the waveform from just a square wave, which is amazing. Anybody that did anything that sounded remotely good were reinventing the wheel at that point and doing it in an amazing way, all of them sounding a little different. So there was a number of really interesting sound engines, as we refer to them now, that were being used on different software houses. Different programmers were using those different engines to create different 1-bit sound. So I've been playing about with those. Just to actually talk about what I've got here, this is hooked up to the telly, but it doesn't not so great for videoing. So I have here a Omni, which is a recreation of the ULA, the uncontended logic array, and the internals effectively of the 128K Spectrum, actually, based in that form factor, based on Chris Smith's amazing book and his work on the, I don't know if you see that, but the ZX Spectrum ULA, how to design a microcomputer, where he went through and said he wanted to effectively rebuild the ULA, the thing that's at the heart of the ZX Spectrum, which he did using and made what's known as the Harlequin board, and that's based upon that. It also has the AY8190 chip in that one, I think, but it's very similar, and for the sake of demo purposes, it's great because it's got the version I've got here has got the screen as well, which is nice. This would beep out of just out of its back, but this one actually beeps through this screen, which is convenient. With the stuff that I've been playing with, I was in love with the sound of the Spectrum and a lot of things about the Spectrum. So I had some other peripherals that were notably odd. Let's get this, one of the more famous ones, which I've actually taken apart for reasons that I don't need. But this is a Currah microspeech, as it's known. There was an interesting design choice that just allowed you access to the circuit board there, so as an expansion port. So there was a whole host of expansion port things available. The Currah microspeech slots in there and gave a I'm going to say proto early version of speech synthesis based upon an allophone system. It had 59 allophones, and you would write software to address that based upon how you chose to break your sound, break your words up. So there'd be like different vowel sounds, different consonant sounds, different combinations of those that were sort of tiny fragments of audio that could then be strung together to make something that approximated words, which I've had great fun playing with in sampling and writing some software to make it say various things. But yeah, I had one of those back then. Again, not a great deal of software written for it exclusively at the time because it was a kind of niche thing, but it got a lot of press and was quite good fun to play with, and I've very much enjoyed playing with that. Of also note, oh, I've got it just there, yeah. a really interesting piece of hardware that was for the, again, accessed in the same way, plugs in the back there. The Cheetah, a company that were putting stuff together, the Cheetah Spectrum, doesn't look like much, that's Spectrum, punning on spectrum and drum, which a lot was effectively a very cheap way of having access to a drum machine. It itself, through its RCA connector, allowed you to get the audio out. The software would be loaded onto the Spectrum and the samples, which would be held in memory. Let's just reiterate, that's 48K of memory, minus screen things, minus the software that's running it. So the amount of sample space, such as it was tiny. And it then, it had software on it that allowed you to write drum patterns and play them back. You could also load in, there was also extra cassettes where you could load in other sounds. There was about 4 of those, sort of different sets of sounds, which I've really enjoyed playing with and seeing what there was, as well as some people have done some more recent things where they've tried to see if it was possible to write software to effectively load new samples into it. As a piece of hardware, it's got quite an unusual sound because the samples themselves are stored in quite an unusual way. This is an 8-bit computer, all of the addressing of the memories, well, the internal Z80 chip that it's based on is an 8-bit chip. The samples in this, actually, for the kick drum, it was a 7-bit sample, so it has quite a crunchy sound, but all the other samples are only 6-bit, meaning that it could be summed to 8-bit quite happily when you had 3 sounds together. So it has quite an interesting, the sounds on this are quite unusual, you know, they don't sound like drum machines of the time, they don't sound bad at all. They're good sounds actually, but they're quite unusual. And the sample rate that's running at is a really unusual sample rate because it's not determined by some clock speed other than the clock speed of the computer, which was and how quickly it could do that. So the numbers involved are not nice numbers like you would see. So you're not looking at something that's 44.1 kilohertz or anything like that, or any multiple thereof or division thereof. You're looking at some bizarre number of those. So it gives it quite an interesting frequency range with quite a, well, without the high frequency stuff in there, but still sounding quite crunchy. It's good. That's an interesting piece of software to have played with. I've really enjoyed that. With the hardware itself, it's been really good fun to explore, and I've done quite a lot of this actually, exploring which of the models, which bits of the hardware are the best sounding in order to record them, because the Spectrum itself has it's got actually the audio out there, which would go to the tape player if you're saving software, which is okay. You know, you can record that. However, you know, you ask the question, is the +2 or the +3 model even, with the one that was a later revision, used a disk drive in it, notably not the floppy disks there's a 3-inch disc rather than a 3/4-inch disc that became popular later. So this was a quite unusual thing. You know, it has got its audio out. They've got stereo audio outs for the AY chip, but also the beeper comes out of there, and just comparing those and seeing which ones gave the best sound was really interesting, because the +3 notably had quite poor sound, quite noisy components, whereas the +2 and the original ones were relatively clean by doing things like removing the UHF. So it would connect to a TV you'd have to tune in. So removing the UHF tuner circuit cleaned up the audio in there as well, which was useful in order to record those a little cleaner. Using things like this, there's actually a modern recreation of an external, so this is an external A912 chip based on that. Moving that externally made for cleaner audio of those things as well. So those kind of things were really interesting to play with and work out how those are. I'm not a complete masochist, so in the main I've not been loading things from cassette to when I've been doing stuff with this. I've been using more modern solutions, and if the last time you thought about a ZX Spectrum or similar was in loading from cassette, then you'll be pleased to know, you'll be pleased to note that things like this Div MMC, or I've got over here, a Div IDE device which plug into the expansion port on, well, I've got more than one actually, so I've got different models for different ZX Spectrums. I have ZX Spectra? I don't know, ZX Spectrums, I think. So that's a Div IDE, that's a Div MMC. So you can put things on SD card in this instance, or compact flash card, and load them pretty much instantaneously, which has been really useful in writing software myself and then testing it on real hardware rather than using emulators. One of the things that's notable about it's always nice to try things on real hardware, because things like the speaker response that is going on is not necessarily working exactly the same when you're doing that under emulation. If all you can do is put the speaker in one of two positions, if people are doing clever things by relying on the fact that physically that speaker is going to spend some time returning, so if you're going, I want to put it forwards, and then I want to put it back, but then I want to put it forwards again. In software, you could be going, oh, I'm going to move it forwards, move it forwards, move it forwards, but keep it in the position in the middle, really, as it's doing that. Software emulation isn't necessarily doing that justice. It's interesting to hear it through the speaker, actually through the speaker. There's also the fact that the speaker itself doesn't have much going on, well, at either end of the frequency spectrum. So if the software that people were writing, particularly stuff that people were doing in 1985, people would be expecting to hear that through that kind of speaker rather than through a full range speaker. So I think people have been more careful. People are a bit more careful when they're writing the software now, rather than those artifacts that might appear in the high frequencies or low frequencies. So what I did for this project, which I had a great deal of, which really tested my skills really, was I'm going to move to this rather than doing it on there and trying to use that screen. But this, like I say, is pretty accurate recreation for the sake of this. What it meant was I could write some software myself, trying to recreate those things that people like Tim Follin were doing, where I've tried to use some of the software techniques that were used by different people writing different engines back in the 80s. So this is going to sound a bit rubbish, but sort of that kind of beepy thing, but also where I've done that and enabled myself to give some kind of real-time control of that. I've named these, but that's just based on the ROM beeper, which I'm polling in arpeggios. I can also retune it with the software and things like that. But then if you I don't know how audible this will be, but the difference in sound there to that, and which are all, they're based upon sound engines that were being used back in 1984. Thinking about it, I think that was a programmer called Lyndon Sharp used a very similar sound engine to that. So they have got quite a distinctive sound. The skill of those programmers who were actually making different sounds. I mean, some of it would just be a side effect of them trying to get something that sounded like multi-timbral music. Polyphonic music, not multi-timbral. The sound of that would be it was probably just what it was, but some of it was amazing. We've then had the one-bit scene has then progressed quite significantly for those people who've been working in it. And, the demo scene was pushed on hugely. This, as I said, the ZX Spectrum, very big in the UK, but it also had a large install base in Spain, in Brazil, in Portugal, and across big swathes of Russia, where there was lots of clones of the ZX Spectrum, often with the AY chips added on. Out of that scene came some really interesting developments. A lot of people in the demo scene have really progressed the one-bit music that in the past 10 years, I suppose. Ridiculous, really, that so many years on from the birth of the computer, people are still doing stuff that is amazing in the audio scene for the Spectrum. The UK had a big install base, a lot of users of the ZX Spectrum in the UK, but also a big set of users in Spain, in Portugal, in Brazil notably, and also across a lot of Russia, Eastern Europe, where there were a lot of clones, unlicensed clones actually, that had slightly different specs of the ZX Spectrum, a lot of those including the AY chip within the builds and stuff like that. Those programmers continued that beyond the commercial life of the ZX Spectrum. By 1990, the ZX Spectrum was very much old news that had been around way too long. It was very long in the tooth at that point, but was still being used in a lot of the demo scene things. And they have continued to then make amazing audio developments where they've written just really, really efficient software. And I've tried to tap into that and build upon those. It's a really friendly scene as well, and it's quite nice to talk to those people online and go, how have you done that? So it's meant you've got sort of these kind of sounds that are based where people have just been doing really transparent programming. The sharing of their resources and stuff online meant that you could disassemble their code and look how that was being done. Lots of analysis of how stuff from the 80s was done, and lots of things built on that, which has been really, really useful to do that. And hopefully, I think I've done a really comprehensive job of sort of taking a really good snapshot of what people are able to do with a piece of hardware that is the same hardware, is the hardware from 1982. I mean, I think this, I'm not sure, I've got two models that are the same, and I'm not sure whether this is the exact one that I had when I was, when I was a kid, or whether it's the other one, but I've got two that are, they've taken a bit of, they've had a few repairs over the time, but they're still going strong. And there's many other ones that are sitting there like this one, just being loan machines for bits and pieces when they've died. But I've got, but that same hardware, people are making audio on it now that if you had a time machine and went back to 1982, you would be burnt at the stake for being a witch. There's no doubt about it, because the audio that people are getting out of it now is astonishing. So I've been leveraging that as well. It's interesting now that, of course, there's more interest perhaps in the ZX Spectrum as we just about to go into 2022 as I'm filming this. You know, it'll be its anniversary this year. You know, 1982 to 2022. The Spectrum Next came out, the modern take on that. It's an interesting beast, this one. I mean, it's hard to, you know, whether, if you're a purist, you might not quite see it as part of the legacy of the Spectrum itself being based on a FPGA, field programmable gate array, rather than the ULA and CPU of the Spectrum itself. But it's it really the legacy's there to see, and I think there's quite a big interest in the Spectrum at the moment because of that. Having sat there feeling like it, in a lot of people's eyes, feeling like a dead machine. So I hope that the stuff that I've done with this is going to open people's eyes to what the Spectrum can sound like. If you've not touched the Spectrum since Manic Miner, I think you're going to be really surprised at how musical it can be. Like I say, there's effectively two strands to the whole thing. The 1-bit stuff, which has just quietly in the background been moving on and developing, and the AY stuff, which itself was part of a broader community of different arcade machines, different computers like the MXX and so forth that used very similar chips. So there was a lot of those, like the Atari ST was based on a similar chip. So some of the sounds would be quite familiar to people who'd perhaps knew arcade games from that sort of era and arcade machines, whereas the 1-bit stuff I think will really surprise some people, as well as some, you know, some really interesting, fun things, like I say, like the Spectrum itself with its, you know, a piece of hardware from 83, 84 maybe, that was an amazing drum machine that has been kind of neglected a little bit. And, you know, as a real weird bit left field thing, the 1983's Cheetah speech unit as well thrown in there, again, as the perhaps the most famous of the other things that made noise on the ZX Spectrum, although the noises it made perhaps not so musical, but still very interesting. So I really feel like it's a dead comprehensive set, and I've absolutely loved this idea of going back to exploring this in a load of depth, rather than just the superficial fanboy that it'd be really easy to be. Yeah, it's great. I hope everybody else enjoys it as much as I've enjoyed doing it.